Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. And in this particular room, in this particular institution, which I have historical, not that historical, connections with. One project I had about 5-6 years ago was helping the BM, the director and his colleagues, to analyze the ways in which space were used on this site and what could be done about making it better and more efficient and more fit for purpose. I remember at the beginning, in my ignorance, I couldn't understand why there were 8 departments, each of which had study rooms, a library, offices for the curators in that department, and access to the objects, some more convenient than others. It seemed to me obvious that there could be some coordination and to greater effect. Some of these spaces behind the scenes, by the way, are extremely beautiful. Others are more utilitarian and less interesting, but on the whole, the world behind the scenes is much more interesting than, in my opinion, than the world in front. So, what I was gently taught was that these 8 departments, which are defined by partly geographical issues and partly by historical issues, ancient Middle East, for example, they are places where learning has accumulated and been tended and developed over centuries, 2 centuries in fact. And they're rich in meaning. And the idea, I can now understand, looking back, how shocked the heads of the departments, the curators, were at my suggestion that there should be an increase in efficiency in the use of space over time. In fact, what came out of the exercise was the development which will be completed in about a year's time, which is the thing that's perhaps most lacking at the time, where the objects can be moved in and out and tended and looked after as they are changed over in the lifetime of the department. So that's why I showed this first slide, and I wonder if anyone recognizes it. Has anyone seen this before? That's all right. When I was a student, not very far from here, in 1959 at the Architectural Association School, we were taken by the man who taught us architectural history, Sir John Summerson, to the John Soane Museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Soane was a very, very important architect at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. He, incidentally, was one of the founders of the RIBA and led the idea of the professionalization of the architectural activities at that time. But his biggest work, grandest work, was the Bank of England. And he got his draftsman, very talented watercolorist called Gandhi, to draw his bank in a ruin in 1,000 years' time. Now, you may think that's vanity, but actually I think it showed a remarkable perception of the influence of architecture and urban form over centuries. That architecture isn't something that is just made and then delivered, and then you say goodbye and move on to the next project. It's about the creation of places that are full of meaning at their best and are extremely important for the transmission of not just of culture, but of also all kinds of other commercial and intellectual opportunities that cities are made up of. So bear that image in mind, that we're not talking about the working environment for the next 5 minutes. We should be thinking in terms of decades, centuries, millennia. And my underlying question, which I think is an ethical one for an architect to ask, and a philosophical one as well, how do you justify place in an increasingly virtual world? What is it that place can do that the wonderful realm of electronics and virtuality can not do. So that is a question that I will keep on asking in the next few minutes. Of course, we are, from my perspective, there are, for my profession, there are three big challenges. Preserving the planet for our children's children, sustainability in other words. There are the amazing opportunities provided by information technology. It gets more and more amazing every day. Universal, instantaneous interconnectedness for good or ill, which leads to increasing mobility within and between workplaces, between cities, between town and country, etc. Absolutely amazing phenomena. And then the third is less cheerful. It's that we have inherited in my world, in architecture and in construction industry, and in property development, a supply chain, in other words, from the money to the end product, that is tyrannous. It is taken for granted as being the normal way of doing things, but I don't believe that we understand the evil and destructive consequences of taking this supply chain for granted. I think we should be much more critical and think much more imaginatively about the relationship between the idea and the act. So it's taken me quite a long time, 5 decades in fact, to come to this rather radical position. The step by step, I just go quickly through it. After my architecture education, learning about office planning, largely from the Northern Europe, from Germany and Scandinavia and Holland. Totally different form of delivery and understanding of what the workplace is in the context of the economy and the city. Then the privilege of studying and living in North America, where again, things were done from a very different perspective in an efficient way, but with problems inherent in it, which even I, at that time, could spot. Then I think I was extremely lucky to be in London a little bit earlier, when the computer escaped from the computer room. I can almost remember the day when it happened, and information technology was everywhere. Then, thinking about these issues globally, and coming back to this fundamental question is, what does place do that non-place doesn't do? And how can we, purveyors, architects and others, purveyors of place, justify our realm? So the first epiphany was, I was still a student at the Architecture Association, and we were given an office building to design in the 4th year. And I'd never been in an office at that time, and I didn't like the look of them. The centre point was under construction down by Tottenham Court Road tube station, and I didn't think it was very beautiful. We were, of course, entranced by images of much more immaculate North American buildings, and some also from Europe, but I didn't know where to start. At that time, in our training, we considered that the brief was extremely important. You had to study what the clients wanted, and if you could possibly do that in a sociological or political background, so much the better. Where was the equivalent of the sociology that was being deployed in the design of housing, believe it or not, in schools, very successfully, universities as well at that time? And it was an October afternoon in the studio in Bedford Square at the AA when I looked at the latest issue of the Architecture Review and found this diagram in a small article by an important journalist and historian called Rainer Banham about a German phenomenon called Bürolandschaft, or office landscaping. And it wasn't the text that struck me so much as the notion, which is absolutely inherent in this little diagram, that the office is somehow a cybernetic mechanism. And if you understood the connectivity, the architecture would follow. An illusion, of course, but it struck me as being a brilliant and luminous idea. And a little bit later that year, I was lucky enough to get a travel scholarship and went to see some of these buildings in Germany and was pretty amazed by the number of things that had been invented in Germany at that time, post-war, post-Nazi Germany, where workers' councils had become a very important device in the negotiation of the quality of working life between employers and the employed. You had to consult the workforce if you were going to propose any change in the environment. And Bürolandschaft came out of that legal contract. And also out of it came carpet. They invented carpet. All office floors at that time in the UK certainly were lino. They invented plants. Never seen a plant in an office before. They invented the freedom of the workforce to be able to go into a Pausenraum anytime they wanted, when they needed a break to have a chat or whatever. And they also disinvented the tea lady. There was no longer a trolley. You could actually go and mix yourself a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is at the kitchen component in part of the office. This was part of your rights as a worker. Very, very interesting insight into a very different sociology. And very handsome some of these buildings were too, architecturally. The very high standard of office life. So putting Bürolandschaft, office landscaping, into context, the dominant mode of delivery and design of offices goes back to Frederick Taylor and the idea of scientific management, which was a rationalist view of studying work and efficiency in order to get the maximum profit out of it. The new emerging office landscaping in social democratic Europe was again a philosophical and political consequence. It was a reaction against fascism and the result of the empowering of the workforce to have their rights when they were discussing with their employers the provision of the workplace. It wouldn't have happened without that social contract. And these two modes of office design have been are being overtaken now by this amazing phenomenon of robust, reliable, ubiquitous 21st century information technology, which is still staggering in its implications and consequences. So the Taylorist, if I can give you some images of what it meant, this is the Larkin building in Buffalo, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, just in the first decade of the 20th century. And a magnificent building, long gone, long torn down. Very idealistic owner of the Larkin organization. There was a mail order house. And there you have the white-coated women, white-bloused women, and the black-coated men on, I have to say, steel case desks, which were made out of steel, believe it or not, at that time, in military order. In the panels in this lovely atrium, beautiful atrium, were messages defined by the owners, things like intelligence, enthusiasm, control, which I rather think they were all in favor of, the owners, and I think probably control was, of the three, the most important rule. So that led to the enormous success in the North American world of office design in the 50s and 60s particularly. And what is important about this pair of images is the dominance of the grid, externally and internally. In other words, you took your place in a world that someone cleverer than you designed and expected you to work within. That was a late echo of the Taylorist philosophy, where you taught a miner or a steel worker to be able to use every muscle in the most efficient way in order to maximize productivity. It dawned on me when as a graduate student in the late 60s and early 70s in the States, and I got to know a space planning practice in New York called JFN Associates, which was the precursor of DEGW, my firm that I eventually founded with my colleagues from the AA. But what I realized in this, I have to say, I do take my hat off to it, very rational system, is that the architects, the design responsibilities were ordered by time. If you're an architect, you designed for the 50-year time horizon, or maybe even less actually, but several decades, and you designed the shell. If you were a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer, you designed services which fitted within the cell in interstices and suspended ceilings and underfloor, if you were lucky in those days, systems. And that set of apparatus was had a 15-year lifespan at best. Then you got the interior designers, or space planners they're called, and they worked for corporate clients. And they worked on what I call scenery, which lasted for about 5 years, in other words, for the length of a lease. It was designed to accommodate the relatively short term. And then there's another level of design which was about the next 5 minutes, and that was the domain of the facilities manager, or what came to be called the facilities manager. So buildings, in fact, aren't made out of steel and glass and wood. They're made out of layers of longevity. Yankee ingenuity at its very best. They all hated each other. The fit-out people, the interior designers or space planners were subservient to the architects who designed the shell. I remember talking to a well-known architect, Philip Johnson, and made the mistake of letting him know that at that time I was doing some consulting to a space planning firm in New York. His office was in New York, and he said, space planners, they're all hacks. And if you know anything about Philip Johnson, you'll just realize how ironic that statement was. But to be efficient and not have a social contract, as it were, to go along with efficiency, it is a characteristic of the North American system, with its amazing successes, of course, one has to say, economically and industrially. But the implications of it for users of office space is that much more money is spent cumulatively over the life of a building on the interior fit-out and the services than upon the architecture. In other words, architecture, cumulatively speaking, is a subset of interior design. So that also struck me as being extremely important. So carrying back to Europe in the early 70s and getting around and seeing what was happening in the world of office design in Europe, I'd set up my firm by that stage. There were absolutely amazing buildings following on, in some ways, the tradition of the Bürolandschaft people, office landscaping, but also following the negotiations conducted between the workforce and the employers. And they went even further than the Germans in Scandinavia. And this building, wonderful architect Niels Torp designed it in the 80s, but it sums up what a different worldview of office work would result in architecturally. You'll notice that there are a series of pavilions of what is a most beautiful, I don't want to call it an atrium because it's actually a street, it's an urban idea. It feels like a street, it's planted, it's lovely, it's full of little cafes and restaurants, representing a very high standard of office life. The pavilions have absolutely standard office rooms. There's no hierarchy expressed in the architecture, and there's one of them on the left in the photograph with a door you can shut and a window you can open, a light you can switch on, and walls you can put your decoration, your items on. So you're in charge as an individual within this very ordered corporate world. And that's the street. And you may not think the Swedes are famous for a sense of humor, but that thing up at the top left is the boardroom, and the cocktail umbrella on top of it is a joke. It is meant to demonstrate that this organization has a sense of humor. And what goes on in the boardroom was a matter of some speculation. But there they are, the street, and the top lit, and the lovely gardens and park outsiders, and I think one of the best offices of the 20th century, no doubt. So that's what happens when it's done extremely well. But then something else happened in the course of this career of mine, that with information technology, the computer not only escaped from the computer room and came down the corridor dragging its cables and its environmental problems with it, it expanded into a universe of possible potential contacts in any order at any time. So to understand the nature of the knowledge economy, you have to imagine something like this, which is a network, ever-changing network of communications. And it didn't take very long, perhaps only a decade, for me to work out that spatially that meant that the actual core space, which is managed by a particular organization, which is on the bottom left-hand side, is actually now probably less than half the amount of space that is used for getting work done. And the non-core space, the space which is not owned by the organization or not managed by the organization, is out in the world, it's in the airport, it's at home, it's in the restaurants, in the car, in the cafe. That is at least as important as a design issue as the official world of the core space. And it doesn't take much of a historian to work out that this was not exactly a new idea. When the Corporation of Lloyds was establishing itself in the beginning of the 18th century, guess where they did their business? In the coffee house, the Starbucks of its day. There they are, these gents with their hats and their documents and their pipes, working away in a public space. And then there's this other, and it has terrible connotations, I know, but it is a really ingenious 19th century invention, thrifty, oh how thrifty, which was the gentleman's club. That's the reform, where you pay a subscription in order to have a palace, have access to a palace, better than many aristocrats had. And this idea of paying for services over time, rather than being a great landlord, was a very spirited invention of the high bourgeoisie in the 19th century, certainly in London. So, I am interested in temporal and spatial conventions. I do not take anything for granted. I think we are capable, as human beings, of inventing the conventions that suit us with the technology that we have and the value system that we subscribe to. Bill Mitchell, my colleague at MIT when I taught there, had this wonderful argument that two iron laws have shaped the workplace since the Industrial Revolution: the necessity of synchrony and the necessity of co-location. He said that neither is valid today. You don't have to be at the same place, and certainly not at the same time, in order to get work done. When people came down from the hills and into the valleys to the mill towns in the early 19th century, they learned to work by the beat of the mechanical drum to be at their workplace at a certain time. This necessity of co-location, which was a kind of tyranny, is no longer necessary. Richard Sennett, who's in his amusing way is a critique of architects, thinks that we are addicted to bigness, overdetermined forms, which are self-indulgent, exchange-driven, and brittle. They break. They fail easily. And the most important of the 3 points is there has been an erosion of the public space. this building would be an example of somewhere where there is layers of privacy and security, but there is a very large and a most important part of the realm of the museum is public. And Richard's critique is that my profession has neglected the interstitial. We've concentrated upon the objects, and we have not thought about, at an urban scale, or even at a building scale, with the interstitial spaces. And I'm allowed to criticize architects. We are far too much in love with what we do. We are serial purveyors of new buildings. That's what we like. On the other hand, we're always pleased to be asked. We turn over and have our tummy tickled when necessary. And we love doing what we're told. We like to pretend we're independent, but we fail to ask obvious questions about why do we have the buildings we have? How well do they work? And we are part, and I don't think many of us know this, we are part of a supply chain in the world of office design, which has got 4 characteristics. It goes in one direction. Once you start it, you can't stop it. It likes being monofunctional, and it loves no feedback. It likes moving on to the next project because they are, that's what God put us on this planet to do, new projects. So using this analysis to look back at the way the office building evolved, and that's the early part of the presentation, the Taylorist office was developer-led, leased buildings, standardized designs, exchange-driven, symbolized by the grid, the very strong grid. The Northern European, German, and Scandinavian and Dutch phenomenon of the social democratic office, which one very famous one I was thinking about the other day, Central Abbey here, where you could take your own furniture and your pets and your parrot and your dog and your plants. That was a deliberate attempt to cede ownership of the space to those who worked there. And then the third layer, which is the question, the networked office. What will that be like? If we're procuring services as much as space, surely there'll have to be some kind of feedback system and responsiveness to customer demand. And surely we'll, instead of paying for the space by the square foot by the year or so, we will pay for services by the hour. And we will have instant feedback about what value has been added and what output has been achieved by the spaces we use. So I've tried to put this on its head and invent a demand chain which would start with the end users, not with the supply side, who would articulate their criteria, probably pay for their services if they work in offices or if they work in interstitial spaces between offices, paid for by the hour. The corporate owners, operators would have to base their skills on user-based criteria and justify themselves in those terms, and they'd probably behave much more like hoteliers than landlords. And then the long-term owners would have to respond to demand. In fact, to give them their due, I think organizations like the Grosvenor Estate and the Bedford Estate, who inherited the tradition of the great London estates of the 18th century, have been quite shrewd in holding on and managing what exists, and making sure that they never ever give it up. They always have control over it. Now, what do buildings do? Rule number 1 is that buildings are inert. They don't do anything except they can hurt you or make you ill sometimes. They don't do anything unless they're told to. They can be efficient, they can be effective, and they can be expressive. And efficiency is the least important of these 3 orders of benefit. And we need some kind of evaluative framework like this to work out how space is worse. And you already know from this morning the amazing phenomenon that these thrifty people throw away the use of space over time because, except in the last very short period, it has never been measured. Meeting rooms are always booked and always empty. and a lot of space is wasted. So how buildings are designed and over time and how they express these values is something that interests me a great deal. Google's a very good example in their particular use of spatial expression to attract certain classes of talent. Now, what I think the opportunity is that lies for us is to use design, construction, occupancy process to reinforce and revitalize organizational culture. That means leadership, systemic thinking, data, user communication, and involvement. And we know just how amazing this technology is. And one of us, if we're a genius and we had to invent a place in a virtual world, what arguments would we have to assemble in order to convince us? And I think there's a lot. And it's a lot about cities, by the way, about memory, chance, accessibility, meaning. And that's why central London and Manhattan, in the early first decade of the 21st century, are thriving because they are full of accidental opportunities. They have dense, multiple overlapping networks. And that's why Rome in the 17th century, this is Nolly's map of Rome, put so much emphasis urbanistically on public space, which is the white in this diagram, the black is private, and there's as much white as there is black. And that's why Canary Wharf is not the model for the 21st century, whereas Soho, with its 1,000 open restaurant doors and its gregarious nature in an 18th century fabric, may be a model. Security is a terrible thing. And back to Soane and his Bank of England, he managed, in his wonderful design, destroyed in the 30s, alas, to create what was actually a fortress externally, internally, into a series of most generous, wonderful spaces. So I think we can reverse Sennett's critique, we can find appropriate scale, buildings that can learn, and to use Sennett's own term, and permeable and semi-public spaces. The spaces in between, in other words, are as important as the spaces within. And I think unless we rethink this office supply chain and recognize its tyranny, we won't be able to create sustainable cities appropriate to the 21st century information technology economy. So thank you for your patience. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Frank. And I think we've just got time for a quick question or two. Is there one out there?
I've shut them up. That's good.
Well, I wanted to ask you something about the cultural implications of all this, because looking at the Social Democratic Stockholm office of the 1980s, it actually looked quite like the BA, I think it's called Waterside.
It's done by the same architect, Waterside.
They were, okay.
Yes, yes.
But much, much later. So I wondered how much...
Well, we Anglo-Saxons are slow to pick up ideas.
So it's to do with that, is it?
Yeah, same ideas, but not carried out with any, if I may say so, with not the same social program behind it.
Yes, so it is quite culturally based, even though multinational companies are operating in obviously in many different parts of the world. So
it's the Canary Wharfs we've got to watch. We really need to worry about that particular form of urbanism.
Right. Any questions? There's one gentleman there. We'll take that one. Microphone coming. It's not on at the minute. Try again.
Oh, sure. Frank, it's Jim Reed from Arrow. Can you hear me?
Just, yes.
Is this microphone on?
If you shout, I'll repeat the question in case people haven't heard it. So.
Frank, I was interested in a part of your presentation when at one point you were self-critical about architects, and you raised the point about feedback was not really entertained. Now, in all honesty, do you think how much of a barrier to progress has that been over the years?
Of which? What was the word?
feedback?
Feedback.
to architects?
I think we've been extremely good at avoiding feedback. We've been quite skillful. Keep moving, I think, is the shorter way of expressing it. And we also have a wonderful trick of, it's called amnesia. You not only you keep moving, but you forget what you did before. I think we're not very good at looking at the stock of space as a whole. We have self-admiring monographs on our work, but not a whisper of criticism would be found in any of these monographs.
How much of a barrier to progress has that been, you think?
It's massive, absolutely massive. It's a disaster, a professional disaster. It's as if medicine hadn't invented epidemiology, which they managed to grab hold of, thank God, at the Berwick Street pump in the early 19th century. We have no equivalent of epidemiology. We don't know about the consequences of what we do over time.
Not learning from past mistakes.
Try this one. Frank, I'm interested in your critique of Canary Wharf and what it is that you've got a problem with.
Well, I'm sure it happened at the right time for at least one set of developers. What I'm worried about, what worries me about Canary Wharf are the interstitial spaces. I showed you this restaurant map of Soho. That was produced by some students who I asked to look at London and comment upon its physical fabric, and they were to compare Canary Wharf and Soho. And they chose the restaurant map of Soho as an indicator of why they liked it, because it was so permeable and accessible. The parallel photograph of Canary Wharf was a security guard coming out of one of the doors of Barclays Bank, in fact, and telling them not to take photographs in the public realm. That is a very strange phenomenon and not entirely pleasant.
Sinister.
Yeah.
It is sinister.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. Very, very good to have you with us.
A very great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.